The conservation laboratory at the Mountain Heritage Preservation Center occupied the entire third floor of a converted textile mill in Boone, North Carolina, where tall windows provided the natural light that restoration specialists needed for their meticulous work. Dr. Rachel Morrison had directed the laboratory for 8 years, overseeing a small team of experts who specialized in preserving and restoring historical photographs, documents, and artifacts from the Appalachian region. Her days followed a predictable rhythm of careful examination, chemical treatments, and digital documentation, work that required infinite patience and a steady hand, but offered the deep satisfaction of rescuing fragile pieces of history from the inevitable decay of time. The laboratory had earned a reputation for excellence throughout the Southeast, and museums, historical societies, and private collectors regularly sent their most challenging projects to Rachel's team, trusting that these damaged and deteriorating materials would be returned to stable condition and made accessible for future generations of researchers and enthusiasts. Rachel had always been drawn to the stories that old photographs could tell, the way a single image could capture not just the appearance of people and places, but also hint at the relationships, emotions, and circumstances that had shaped a particular moment in time. She had studied art history and chemistry in college, a combination that had prepared her perfectly for the technical and interpretive challenges of photographic conservation, and she had spent years developing techniques for stabilizing fragile emulsions, removing stains and discoloration, and digitally reconstructing damaged areas while maintaining the integrity and authenticity of the original images. Each photograph that came through the laboratory presented unique challenges, and Rachel approached every project with the same combination of scientific rigor and historical curiosity, always wondering about the people depicted in the images and the circumstances that had led to the creation and preservation of these visual records. On a humid morning in late June, Rachel received a package from the estate of Margaret Holloway, a retired schoolteacher from Watauga County who had recently passed away at the age of 97. The package contained a single photograph in remarkably poor condition, its surface marred by water stains, mold damage, and areas where the emulsion had begun to separate from its paper backing. The accompanying letter, written by Margaret's granddaughter, explained that this photograph had been discovered in a locked metal box in Margaret's attic, along with several other family documents that had apparently been stored there for decades. The granddaughter knew very little about the photograph, except that it dated from the early 20th century and depicted members of the Holloway family at some kind of gathering or celebration. She hoped that Rachel's laboratory could stabilize the image and perhaps make it clear enough to identify the people shown, as Margaret had never spoken about this particular photograph and the family was curious about its origins and significance. Rachel carefully removed the photograph from its protective wrapping and placed it on her examination table under bright LED lights that would allow her to assess the extent of the damage. The image showed a group of approximately 15 people arranged in front of a wooden building that appeared to be a church or meeting hall, their clothing and the photographic technique suggesting a date around 1904 or 1905. Despite the significant deterioration, Rachel could make out several distinct figures, men in dark suits and women in long dresses with high collars and elaborate hairstyles typical of the Edwardian era. The composition was formal and carefully arranged, with taller individuals standing in the back row and shorter ones seated in front, suggesting that this was an important occasion that warranted the expense and effort of hiring a professional photographer to document the gathering. As Rachel began her preliminary examination, using a magnifying glass to study the details that remained visible through the damage, she noticed something unusual about one of the women seated in the front row. This woman, who appeared to be in her 30s with dark hair pulled back in a simple style, had positioned her hands in her lap in a way that seemed awkward and unnatural compared to the relaxed poses of the other people in the photograph. Her fingers were curved inward and pressed tightly together, as if she were deliberately concealing something within her clasped hands, and there was a tension visible in her shoulders and neck that contrasted sharply with the calm, pleasant expressions worn by everyone else in the group. Rachel leaned closer, intrigued by this detail that suggested a story beneath the surface of what appeared to be a straightforward group portrait, and she felt the familiar thrill of discovery that came whenever a photograph revealed itself to be more complex and mysterious than it had initially appeared. Rachel spent the rest of that day carefully documenting the photograph's current condition, taking high-resolution digital images from multiple angles and under different lighting conditions to create a complete record before beginning any restoration work. She noted every stain, tear, and area of emulsion loss, creating a detailed map that would guide her treatment decisions and allow her to track the progress of the restoration. The photograph measured approximately 8 by 10 inches and had been printed on a paper stock that was common in the early 1900s, with a glossy surface that had protected the image to some degree, but had also made it vulnerable to the kind of water damage that had clearly affected this particular print. The edges were badly deteriorated, and several areas in the upper right corner had lost their emulsion entirely, leaving blank spaces where faces or other details had once been visible. As Rachel worked through her initial assessment, she kept returning to the woman with the strangely positioned hands, studying the way her fingers curved and overlapped in a manner that seemed deliberately designed to hide something from the camera's view. The woman's face showed no obvious signs of distress or discomfort, her expression as neutral and composed as those of her companions, but there was something in her eyes that suggested awareness and intention, as if she knew exactly what she was doing and had carefully calculated how to accomplish her purpose without drawing attention to herself. Rachel had examined thousands of historical photographs during her career, and she had developed an instinct for detecting the small anomalies and inconsistencies that often pointed toward hidden stories or suppressed information, and this woman's posture and hand position definitely qualified as anomalous in ways that demanded explanation. Rachel decided to begin the restoration process with a technique called raking light examination, which involved positioning a strong light source at a very low angle to the photograph's surface, so that any texture, indentation, or three-dimensional feature would cast shadows and become more visible. This technique was particularly useful for detecting details that had been obscured by stains or fading, and Rachel hoped it might reveal more information about what the woman was holding in her hands. She carefully positioned the photograph on a stable platform and adjusted her examination light to create the optimal angle, then slowly moved the light across the surface while observing the results through her magnifying glass. The technique immediately revealed details that had not been visible under normal lighting conditions, including subtle variations in the emulsion, thickness that suggested the presence of small objects or shapes beneath the woman's curved fingers. Rachel felt her pulse quicken as she realized that the woman was definitely holding something, some small object or objects that she had deliberately concealed within her clasped hands, while the photographer prepared and exposed the image. The raking light revealed what appeared to be the edge of something flat and rectangular, possibly a piece of paper or a small photograph, protruding slightly between the woman's thumb and forefinger in a way that would have been invisible to a casual observer, but became apparent under the specialized lighting that Rachel was using. There was also a suggestion of something else, perhaps a second object, visible as a slight bulge beneath the fabric of the woman's dress where her hands rested in her lap, indicating that she might have been concealing multiple items rather than just a single object. This discovery transformed what had seemed like a routine restoration project into something far more intriguing, and Rachel immediately began considering how she might use advanced imaging techniques to reveal more details about the concealed objects without damaging the fragile photograph. She had access to several technologies that could potentially help, including infrared photography, which could sometimes reveal details beneath surface layers, and a technique called reflectance transformation, imaging that used multiple light sources to create highly detailed, three-dimensional maps of surface features. Rachel also knew that she would need to research the Holloway family history to understand the context of this photograph and potentially identify the woman who had gone to such lengths to hide something from view while still participating in what appeared to be an important family or community gathering. The photograph had suddenly become a puzzle that demanded solving, and Rachel felt energized by the challenge of uncovering whatever secret this unknown woman had carried in her hands more than a century ago. Rachel contacted Margaret Holloway's granddaughter the following morning to ask whether any family records or documents might help identify the people in the photograph or explain the circumstances under which it had been taken. The granddaughter, whose name was Jennifer Caldwell, explained that her grandmother had been intensely private about certain aspects of her family history and had rarely discussed her ancestors or the early years of the Holloway family in Watauga County. Jennifer had found several boxes of old papers in Margaret's attic, along with the photograph, including some letters, a few pages from what appeared to be a diary, and various legal documents related to property transactions and estate settlements. She offered to bring these materials to the laboratory so that Rachel could examine them, hoping that they might contain information relevant to understanding the mysterious photograph and the woman who had hidden something in her hands. When Jennifer arrived at the laboratory 3 days later, she carried 2 cardboard boxes filled with documents that had clearly been stored in less than ideal conditions for many years. Rachel could see water stains on some of the papers and evidence of insect damage on others, but many of the documents appeared to be in reasonably good condition and potentially readable. Jennifer explained that she had done some preliminary sorting of the materials and had identified several items that seemed to date from the early 1900s, around the same time as the photograph. She had also found a small notebook that contained what appeared to be a family tree, with names and dates written in a careful hand. That might help identify the people shown in the image. Jennifer was clearly excited about the possibility of learning more about her family history, and she told Rachel that discovering the photograph and these documents had sparked an interest in genealogy that she had never felt before. Rachel spent the next several days carefully examining the documents that Jennifer had provided, looking for any references to photographs, family gatherings, or events that might correspond to the scene captured in the damaged image she was working to restore. She found several letters written in 1904 and 1905 that mentioned a woman named Elizabeth Holloway, who appeared to be Margaret's grandmother and possibly the woman with the concealed hands in the photograph. The letters were written by Elizabeth's sister, who lived in Tennessee, and they contained references to some kind of difficulty or trouble that Elizabeth was experiencing. Though the specific nature of the problem was never clearly stated, the sisters' letters were supportive and encouraging, urging Elizabeth to remain strong and to trust that everything would work out for the best, but they were frustratingly vague about the actual circumstances that had prompted this correspondence. The most significant discovery came when Rachel found a single page torn from a diary, dated October 1904, written in a flowing script that matched the handwriting in some of the letters. The entry was brief and cryptic, but it contained a reference that immediately caught Rachel's attention and seemed directly relevant to the photograph she was restoring. The writer, who Rachel believed was Elizabeth Holloway herself, described attending a church anniversary celebration where a photographer had been hired to document the occasion. Elizabeth wrote about feeling anxious during the photography session, about holding tight to something precious that she could not risk losing or having discovered, and about her relief when the photographer finally finished and she could return home without incident. The entry ended with a prayer of gratitude and a statement that she would keep her secret safe, no matter what challenges might come. Rachel read the diary entry multiple times, feeling certain that this was a direct reference to the photograph she was restoring, and that Elizabeth Holloway was indeed the woman who had concealed something in her hands during the photography session. But what had she been hiding, and why had it been so important to keep it secret, even while participating in a public event where her image would be permanently recorded? Rachel returned to the photograph with renewed focus, determined to use every technique at her disposal to reveal the nature of the concealed objects and to understand the story behind Elizabeth's anxiety and secrecy. She began preparing for an infrared photography session, a process that would require careful setup and calibration, but might finally reveal what Elizabeth had been holding in her tightly clasped hands on that October day in 1904. The infrared photography session took place on a cool morning in early July, with Rachel's colleague Dr. Thomas Chen assisting with the specialized equipment and lighting setup required for this type of imaging. Infrared photography worked by capturing light wavelengths that were invisible to the human eye, but could penetrate certain materials and reveal details that were hidden under normal viewing conditions. The technique had proven particularly useful for examining historical documents and photographs, sometimes revealing text that had been erased or obscured, or showing details beneath layers of dirt and deterioration that conventional photography could not detect. Rachel had used infrared imaging successfully on dozens of projects over the years, but she always felt a sense of anticipation when setting up for a new session, never quite knowing what secrets the technology might reveal. Thomas carefully positioned the photograph under the infrared camera, while Rachel adjusted the lighting to eliminate any reflections or glare that might interfere with the imaging process. They worked in near darkness, using only the dim red safe lights that would not affect the infrared-sensitive equipment, and the laboratory took on an almost theatrical atmosphere as they prepared to capture images that might finally solve the mystery of what Elizabeth Holloway had been hiding. After nearly an hour of adjustments and test shots, they were ready to begin the actual imaging session, and Rachel felt her hands trembling slightly as she triggered the camera to capture the first high-resolution infrared photograph of Elizabeth's clasped hands. The results exceeded Rachel's most optimistic expectations, and as the image appeared on the computer monitor, both she and Thomas leaned forward in amazement at what the infrared photography had revealed. Elizabeth's hands, which had appeared as an indistinct blur of flesh tones and shadows in the visible light photograph, now showed remarkable detail and clarity in the infrared image. The concealed objects were clearly visible, no longer hidden by the curve of her fingers or the limitations of conventional photography. Rachel could see that Elizabeth had been holding two distinct items: a small tin-type photograph, approximately 2 inches square, showing the portrait of a young man in military uniform, and what appeared to be a folded piece of paper or letter, its edges visible between Elizabeth's fingers where she had gripped it tightly to prevent it from slipping or being noticed by the other people gathered for the group portrait. Thomas immediately began enhancing the infrared image, using specialized software to increase contrast and sharpen details, and within minutes, they had a clear view of the tin-type photograph that Elizabeth had concealed. The young man in the military portrait appeared to be in his early 20s, with a serious expression and a uniform that Rachel recognized as belonging to the United States Army, from the period around 1898 to 1902. The uniform details were sharp enough that Rachel felt confident she could identify the specific regiment and possibly even trace the identity of the soldier through military records. The folded paper was more difficult to analyze, as only its edges were visible in the infrared image, but Rachel could see what appeared to be handwriting on the exposed portions, suggesting that this was indeed a letter rather than some other type of document. Rachel and Thomas spent the rest of that day creating multiple infrared images from different angles and with various filter combinations, building a comprehensive digital record of everything that could be detected about the concealed objects. They also used a technique called multispectral imaging, which captured the photograph under multiple wavelengths of light ranging from ultraviolet through visible light to infrared, creating a data set that could be analyzed to reveal even more subtle details about the materials and composition of the hidden items. By late afternoon, they had assembled a remarkable collection of enhanced images that showed Elizabeth's secret in unprecedented detail, and Rachel felt a profound sense of connection to this woman who had lived more than a century ago and had gone to such lengths to keep these precious items close to her during what must have been a difficult and uncertain time in her life. Armed with the enhanced infrared images, Rachel returned to the documents that Jennifer had provided, searching for any references to a young man who might have served in the military around the turn of the century and who might have had a connection to Elizabeth Holloway. She found the answer in a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, correspondence that had been exchanged between Elizabeth and a man named Daniel Patterson during the years 1900 to 1903. The letters revealed a tender and devoted relationship between two young people who had grown up in neighboring communities and had planned to marry once Daniel completed his military service. Daniel had enlisted in the army in 1898, motivated by a combination of patriotic duty and the practical need to earn money that would allow him to establish a household and support a family. The letters documented Daniel's experiences during his military service, including his deployment to the Philippines during the final stages of the conflict that followed the conclusion of the war with Spain. Daniel wrote about the challenges of military life, the strange and beautiful landscape of the islands, and his longing to return home to Elizabeth and begin the life they had planned together. Elizabeth's letters, which Daniel had apparently returned to her at some point, expressed her unwavering support and her dreams of their future together, describing the home she hoped they would build and the children she imagined they would raise. The correspondence painted a picture of a deep and genuine love between two people who had been separated by circumstances beyond their control, but who remained committed to each other despite the distance and uncertainty. The final letter in the bundle, dated March 1903, was written in a different hand and came from Daniel's commanding officer, informing Elizabeth that Daniel had died of fever while stationed in the Philippines and that his personal effects would be returned to his family. The letter was formal and brief, offering condolences and praising Daniel's service and character, but providing few details about the circumstances of his death or his final days. Rachel felt tears forming as she read this letter, understanding now why Elizabeth had clutched that tin-type photograph and what was presumably Daniel's last letter to her during the church anniversary celebration in October 1904. Elizabeth had been mourning the loss of the man she had expected to marry, holding on to the only physical reminders she had of their relationship and their shattered dreams. Rachel continued searching through the documents and found additional information that helped her understand Elizabeth's situation more fully. In 1904, Elizabeth had been living with her parents and working as a seamstress. Her prospects for marriage significantly diminished by the fact that she had been engaged to Daniel and was now considered by many in her community to be somehow marked by that failed relationship. The social conventions of the time were unforgiving toward women whose engagements had ended, even when the termination was due to death rather than choice, and Elizabeth would have faced considerable pressure to move on, to put away her memories of Daniel, and to make herself available for courtship by other men. The church anniversary celebration, where the photograph was taken, had been a major community event, and Elizabeth's attendance would have been expected and perhaps even required by her family, who were prominent members of the congregation. Understanding this context, Rachel realized that Elizabeth's decision to conceal Daniel's photograph and letter during the group portrait was an act of quiet defiance and private devotion. She could not openly display her continued mourning for a man who had been dead for more than a year, could not refuse to participate in community events, or maintain the kind of extended mourning period that might have been acceptable for a widow, but was considered excessive for a woman whose engagement had ended before marriage. But she could keep Daniel close to her heart in this secret way, holding his image and his words in her hands, while presenting a composed and socially acceptable face to the camera and to the community that was watching and judging her behavior. The photograph that had seemed merely damaged and mysterious now revealed itself as a document of remarkable emotional complexity, capturing a moment when a grieving woman found a way to honor her lost love while conforming to the expectations of her time and place. Rachel's discovery of Elizabeth's story and the significance of the concealed objects transformed her approach to the restoration project, and she began to see the damaged photograph not just as a technical challenge, but as a precious historical document that deserved the most careful and respectful treatment possible. She decided to create a comprehensive restoration plan that would not only stabilize the photograph and repair the visible damage, but would also produce enhanced images that revealed the full story of what Elizabeth had been holding in her hands. Rachel knew that this project had the potential to become an important case study in photographic conservation and historical interpretation, demonstrating how advanced imaging techniques could uncover hidden narratives and provide insights into the emotional lives of people who had lived in earlier eras when social conventions often required the suppression of genuine feelings and experiences. Over the following weeks, Rachel worked methodically through each stage of the restoration process, beginning with careful surface cleaning to remove dirt and mold residue that had accumulated over decades of improper storage. She used specialized solvents and gentle mechanical techniques to stabilize areas where the emulsion was separating from its paper backing, carefully reattaching these fragile layers and ensuring that no additional detail would be lost. The water stains proved particularly challenging, as they had penetrated deep into the paper fibers and created discoloration that could not be completely removed without risking damage to the image itself. Rachel decided to reduce the stains as much as possible through chemical treatment, but to leave some evidence of the photograph's history and the conditions it had survived, believing that these imperfections were part of the object's story and should not be entirely erased. As the restoration progressed, Rachel maintained regular contact with Jennifer Caldwell, sharing updates on the work and discussing the discoveries she had made about Elizabeth Holloway and Daniel Patterson. Jennifer was deeply moved by the story of her great-great-grandmother's lost love and her quiet act of remembrance during the church anniversary celebration. She told Rachel that learning about Elizabeth's experience had given her a new appreciation for the emotional complexity of women's lives in earlier generations and had made her think differently about the assumptions she had made regarding the relative simplicity or constraint of life in rural Appalachian communities during the early 20th century. Jennifer began conducting her own research into the Holloway and Patterson families, using online genealogy resources and local historical records to trace the descendants of both families and to learn more about the communities in which they had lived. The breakthrough in understanding the full significance of Elizabeth's concealed letter came when Rachel used advanced digital enhancement techniques to analyze the portions of the folded paper that were visible in the infrared images. By carefully adjusting contrast and sharpness, she was able to make out several words written on the exposed edges of the letter, including what appeared to be an endearment and a date that corresponded to just weeks before Daniel's death. Rachel realized that this was likely the last letter Elizabeth had received from Daniel, his final communication before the fever that would claim his life, and that she had been holding this precious document during the photograph session as a way of keeping Daniel present with her during a community event that must have felt lonely and difficult without him beside her. Rachel decided that the restoration project needed to include not just the technical work of stabilizing and repairing the photograph, but also a comprehensive documentation of Elizabeth's story and the historical context that gave meaning to her concealed act of remembrance. She began preparing a detailed report that would accompany the restored photograph, including transcriptions of the letters between Elizabeth and Daniel, copies of the infrared images that revealed the concealed objects, and a narrative explanation of how the various pieces of evidence had come together to tell this remarkable story of love and loss. Rachel also started planning a public presentation of her findings, believing that Elizabeth's story deserved to be shared with a wider audience and that it could contribute to a deeper understanding of how people in earlier generations navigated grief and social expectations in communities where personal feelings were often subordinated to collective norms and traditions. The completed restoration was unveiled at a special event at the Mountain Heritage Preservation Center in late September, nearly 3 months after Rachel had first received the damaged photograph from Jennifer Caldwell. The event attracted a diverse audience, including local historians, genealogists, members of the Holloway and Patterson families, and community members who were interested in learning about the hidden story that advanced imaging technology had revealed. Rachel had prepared a multimedia presentation that walked the audience through each stage of the investigation and restoration, showing the original damaged photograph, the infrared images that had revealed the concealed objects, and the final restored version that now showed Elizabeth Holloway and her companions with remarkable clarity and detail. The presentation also included readings from the letters between Elizabeth and Daniel, providing intimate glimpses into their relationship and their hopes for a future that had been tragically cut short. The response from the audience was overwhelmingly emotional, with many people visibly moved by Elizabeth's story and the realization that this ordinary-looking group photograph contained such profound personal meaning for the woman who had concealed her grief within her clasped hands. Several elderly attendees shared their own family stories of lost loves and suppressed emotions, noting that the social pressures Elizabeth had faced were not unique to her time period, but had persisted well into the 20th century in many rural communities where conformity and propriety were highly valued. Jennifer Caldwell spoke about what the discovery had meant to her family, explaining that learning about Elizabeth's experience had inspired several relatives to begin exploring their own family histories and to ask older family members about stories and experiences that might otherwise be lost when those generations passed away. Rachel's presentation also sparked considerable discussion about the ethics and methodology of using advanced technology to reveal details that the original subjects of photographs had deliberately concealed. Some audience members questioned whether Rachel had violated Elizabeth's privacy by exposing something she had clearly intended to keep hidden, while others argued that the passage of more than a century had transformed the photograph from a private document into a historical artifact that could legitimately be studied and interpreted for the insights it offered into past experiences and social conditions. Rachel acknowledged the complexity of these ethical questions and explained that she had thought carefully about how to present her findings in a way that honored Elizabeth's memory and respected her intentions, while also recognizing the value of sharing stories that illuminated aspects of historical experience that were often overlooked or forgotten. The discussion continued long after the formal presentation ended, with small groups gathering around the displayed photograph and the accompanying materials to examine the details and debate the implications of Rachel's discoveries. Several historians expressed interest in using similar techniques to examine photographs in their own collections, wondering what other hidden stories might be revealed through careful analysis and advanced imaging. Genealogists discussed the importance of preserving not just the factual details of family trees, but also the emotional narratives and personal experiences that gave meaning to those bare facts of births, marriages, and deaths. And several artists and photographers reflected on how the knowledge of what Elizabeth had been hiding changed their perception of the photograph, transforming what had appeared to be a straightforward group portrait into a complex meditation on the relationship between public presentation and private feeling. As the evening drew to a close, Rachel found herself standing before the restored photograph with Jennifer Caldwell and several other Holloway family descendants, all of them studying Elizabeth's face and hands with new understanding and appreciation. Jennifer remarked that she had always thought of her ancestors as distant and somewhat abstract figures, names and dates in a family tree, rather than real people with complex emotional lives and difficult choices to navigate. But learning about Elizabeth's love for Daniel and her quiet act of defiance in holding on to his memory, despite social pressure to move on, had made her great-great-grandmother feel real and present in a way that no amount of genealogical research could have accomplished. Rachel felt deeply satisfied by this response, knowing that her work had succeeded, not just in restoring a damaged photograph, but in recovering a human story that might otherwise have remained forever hidden and unknown. In the weeks following the public presentation, Rachel received numerous inquiries from museums, historical societies, and private individuals who wanted to know more about the techniques she had used to reveal Elizabeth's concealed objects and whether similar methods might be applied to photographs in their own collections. She began developing a series of workshops and training sessions that would teach other conservation professionals how to use infrared photography and multispectral imaging to examine historical photographs for hidden details and previously unnoticed features. The response to these educational offerings exceeded Rachel's expectations, and within months, she had trained more than 50 conservators and curators from institutions across the United States and Canada, creating a network of professionals who were now looking at their photographic collections with fresh eyes and new questions about what stories might be waiting to be discovered. The story of Elizabeth Holloway and her concealed photograph also attracted attention from journalists and media outlets, and Rachel found herself being interviewed for articles in regional newspapers and national magazines that focused on history, genealogy, and cultural heritage. These articles brought Elizabeth's story to an even wider audience and generated additional interest in the work of the Mountain Heritage Preservation Center and the broader field of photographic conservation. Several people contacted Rachel to share their own family photographs that contained mysterious or puzzling elements, hoping that advanced imaging techniques might reveal explanations for details that had confused or intrigued family members for generations. Rachel was able to help several of these individuals uncover hidden aspects of their family histories, including one case where infrared imaging revealed that a woman in a family portrait had been holding a small Bible that contained handwritten family records that had been thought lost for decades. Jennifer Caldwell continued her research into the Holloway and Patterson families, and her investigations led to several additional discoveries that enriched the understanding of Elizabeth's life and the context of the 1904 photograph. Jennifer found census records showing that Elizabeth had eventually married in 1908, 4 years after the church anniversary photograph was taken, to a widower named Thomas Brennan, who had 3 young children from his first marriage. The marriage appeared to have been successful and stable, with Elizabeth and Thomas raising his children and having 2 additional children of their own. Jennifer also discovered that Elizabeth had lived to the age of 78, passing away in 1950, and that she had been remembered in her community as a devoted mother and grandmother who was known for her kindness and her skill as a seamstress and quilter. Most significantly, Jennifer found a brief oral history interview that had been conducted with one of Elizabeth's daughters in the 1970s as part of a local history project. In this interview, the daughter mentioned that her mother had kept a small tin box on her dresser throughout her life, and that the box had contained a photograph of a young soldier and some old letters that Elizabeth would sometimes take out and read when she thought she was alone. The daughter had asked about the photograph once when she was a child, and Elizabeth had explained that it was a picture of a very dear friend from long ago who had gone away and never come back. The daughter remembered that her mother's eyes had filled with tears as she spoke, and that she had carefully returned the photograph and letters to the tin box and placed it back on the dresser where it remained until Elizabeth's death. This testimony confirmed that Elizabeth had treasured Daniel's memory throughout her entire life, even after marrying and building a new family, and that the objects she had concealed in her hands during the 1904 photograph had remained precious to her for nearly 5 decades. Rachel incorporated these new discoveries into an expanded version of her presentation, and she began working on a scholarly article that would document the entire investigation and discuss the broader implications of using advanced imaging technology to study historical photographs. She argued that conservators and historians had an obligation to look beyond the obvious content of photographic images and to consider what might be hidden or deliberately concealed by the subjects of these photographs. Every photograph, Rachel suggested, was a negotiation between public presentation and private reality, and the most interesting and meaningful stories were often found in the gaps and tensions between what was openly displayed and what was carefully hidden. Elizabeth's photograph was a perfect example of this principle, appearing on the surface to be a simple group portrait, but revealing upon closer examination a complex story of love, loss, grief, and the strategies that people developed to maintain their private emotional lives within communities that demanded conformity and the suppression of feelings that did not align with social expectations. The scholarly article that Rachel published in the Journal of Photographic Conservation received widespread attention within the professional community and sparked a broader conversation about the role of technology in historical research and the ethical responsibilities of conservators who used advanced techniques to reveal information that original subjects had intended to keep private. Several prominent historians and ethicists contributed responses to Rachel's article, with some praising her work as an important contribution to understanding the emotional lives of people in earlier eras, while others expressed concern about the potential for such techniques to be used in ways that violated the privacy and dignity of historical subjects. Rachel welcomed this debate, believing that the conservation field needed to develop clearer ethical guidelines for the use of advanced imaging technologies, and that open discussion of these issues would ultimately lead to more thoughtful and responsible practices. The restored photograph of Elizabeth Holloway and the documentation of her story became a permanent part of the Mountain Heritage Preservation Center's collection, and Rachel worked with the exhibition team to create a display that would allow visitors to understand both the technical aspects of the restoration and the human story that the investigation had revealed. The display included the original damaged photograph, the restored version, selected infrared images showing the concealed objects, transcriptions of letters between Elizabeth and Daniel, and interpretive text that explained the social and historical context of Elizabeth's actions. The exhibition also featured a video presentation that walked visitors through the restoration process and showed how advanced imaging techniques had made it possible to see details that had been invisible for more than a century. The exhibition attracted steady streams of visitors from the local community and from across the region, with many people spending considerable time studying the photographs and reading the letters that documented Elizabeth and Daniel's relationship. The museum's comment book filled with reflections from visitors who found personal meaning in Elizabeth's story, with many people noting that they had experienced similar situations in their own lives, where social expectations or family pressures had required them to hide their true feelings or to suppress grief that others considered excessive or inappropriate. Several visitors shared stories of their own lost loves or of family members who had carried secret sorrows throughout their lives, and Rachel realized that Elizabeth's experience resonated across generations because it spoke to universal human needs for both connection and privacy, for both social belonging and individual authenticity. The success of the Elizabeth Holloway project led Rachel to propose a new initiative at the Mountain Heritage Preservation Center, focused specifically on using advanced imaging techniques to study photographic collections for hidden details and previously unnoticed features. The center's board of directors enthusiastically approved the proposal, and Rachel received funding to acquire additional equipment and to hire a research assistant who would help systematically examine the thousands of photographs in the center's collection. Within the first year of this initiative, Rachel and her team identified more than 30 photographs that contained interesting anomalies or hidden details, including several cases where people had concealed objects in their hands or clothing, and others where careful examination revealed previously unnoticed figures in backgrounds or reflections in windows and mirrors. Each of these discoveries led to new research projects and new stories about the people depicted in the photographs and the circumstances that had led them to hide or reveal particular aspects of their lives and experiences. Rachel found that the work was endlessly fascinating and deeply meaningful, connecting her technical skills as a conservator with her passion for understanding the human dimensions of historical experience. She had always believed that photographs were more than just visual records of past events, that they were complex documents that required careful interpretation and contextual understanding, and the Elizabeth Holloway project had confirmed and deepened that conviction. Every photograph, Rachel now understood, was a story waiting to be told, and her job as a conservator was not just to preserve the physical object, but to help recover and share the human experiences that these images contained and represented. 5 years after the completion of the Elizabeth Holloway restoration project, Rachel stood in the conservation laboratory looking at a new photograph that had just arrived for treatment, and she found herself thinking about how much her approach to her work had changed since that humid morning when she had first examined the damaged image of Elizabeth with her mysteriously clasped hands. She had always been a careful and thorough conservator, but the experience of uncovering Elizabeth's story had taught her to look beyond the obvious damage and deterioration, to consider what other information might be hidden within the photographs that came through her laboratory. She now approached every project with a sense of curiosity and possibility, wondering what stories might be revealed through careful observation and the application of advanced imaging techniques, and this shift in perspective had transformed her work from a primarily technical practice into something that felt more like detective work or archaeological excavation. Rachel had trained a new generation of conservators in these methods, and the Mountain Heritage Preservation Center had become recognized internationally as a leader in the field of photographic analysis and the recovery of hidden historical narratives. The Elizabeth Holloway photograph had become something of a legend within the conservation community, frequently cited in conference presentations and scholarly articles as an example of how technology could be used to reveal hidden dimensions of historical photographs and to recover stories that might otherwise remain forever unknown. Rachel had presented the case study at numerous professional gatherings, and she had been invited to consult on similar projects at institutions around the world, helping other conservators develop protocols for using infrared photography and multispectral imaging to examine their collections. The techniques that had revealed Elizabeth's concealed photograph and letter had been refined and improved over the years, and they were now standard tools in the field of photographic conservation, used routinely to examine damaged or deteriorated images for details that might not be visible under normal viewing conditions. Museums and archives that had previously focused solely on preserving the physical integrity of their photographic collections were now investing in advanced imaging equipment and training their staff to look for the kinds of hidden details that Rachel's work had demonstrated could transform understanding of historical images and the people they depicted. Jennifer Caldwell had continued her genealogical research and had become an active member of several historical and genealogical societies in North Carolina, frequently giving presentations about her family history and the discoveries that had resulted from the restoration of the 1904 photograph. She had also written a book about Elizabeth Holloway and Daniel Patterson, combining the documentary evidence that Rachel had helped uncover with imaginative reconstructions of their relationship and the social world in which they had lived. The book had been well received by readers interested in Appalachian history and women's experiences in the early 20th century, and it had inspired several other descendants of the Holloway and Patterson families to come forward with additional documents and stories that further enriched the understanding of these two families and their communities. Jennifer had also established a small scholarship fund in Elizabeth's name to support young women from rural Appalachian communities who wanted to pursue education in history, conservation, or related fields, believing that her great-great-grandmother would have appreciated efforts to help future generations learn about and preserve the stories of their ancestors and communities. The impact of the Elizabeth Holloway project extended far beyond the conservation and genealogy communities, influencing how educators, artists, and community organizers thought about the relationship between personal memory and public history. Several documentary filmmakers had contacted Rachel about creating a film based on Elizabeth's story, and while she had declined most of these offers, she had eventually agreed to work with a small production company that specialized in thoughtful historical documentaries. The resulting film, which premiered at a regional film festival and was later broadcast on public television, used the restoration of the photograph as a framework for exploring broader themes about love, loss, and the ways that people in earlier generations navigated the tension between private feelings and social expectations. The film included interviews with historians, psychologists, and ordinary people who shared their own experiences of hidden grief and suppressed emotions, and it sparked conversations in communities across the country about the importance of acknowledging and honoring the full complexity of human emotional experience rather than demanding that people conform to narrow social scripts about appropriate feelings and behaviors. Most importantly, the Elizabeth Holloway Project had demonstrated the value of collaboration between conservation professionals, family historians, and community members in recovering and preserving stories that might otherwise be lost. Rachel had learned that the technical work of restoration was only one part of understanding historical photographs, and that the real meaning of these images emerged through the combination of scientific analysis, archival research, and the knowledge and memories held by descendants and community members. She had also learned that every photograph contained multiple layers of meaning, and that the most interesting and significant stories were often found not in what was openly displayed, but in what was hidden, concealed, or deliberately obscured by the people who had posed for these images more than a century ago. This understanding had led Rachel to develop new approaches to community engagement, creating programs that invited people to bring their family photographs to the center for examination and discussion, and establishing partnerships with local historical societies and genealogical groups to ensure that the stories uncovered through conservation work would be shared with the communities that had the strongest connections to these histories. The photograph of Elizabeth Holloway had been reproduced countless times in the years since its restoration, appearing in textbooks, museum exhibitions, and online collections, but Rachel always felt that the most meaningful engagement with the image happened when people stood before the original in the Mountain Heritage Preservation Center's permanent exhibition. She had observed hundreds of visitors studying Elizabeth's face and hands, reading the letters between Elizabeth and Daniel, and reflecting on what it must have been like to attend that church anniversary celebration while holding tight to the only physical reminders of a love that had been cut short by tragedy. Many visitors spent long periods in front of the display, and Rachel had overheard countless conversations in which people connected Elizabeth's experience to their own lives, sharing stories of lost loves, hidden griefs, and the various strategies they had developed for maintaining their authentic selves within social contexts that demanded conformity or the suppression of inconvenient emotions. As Rachel continued her work at the Mountain Heritage Preservation Center, she remained inspired by Elizabeth Holloway's quiet act of defiance and remembrance, by her determination to keep Daniel Patterson close to her heart, even when social conventions demanded that she move on and forget. The photograph that had captured Elizabeth with her hands clasped tightly around Daniel's image and his final letter had become a powerful reminder that historical photographs were not simple or transparent records of past events, but rather complex documents that required careful interpretation and empathetic imagination to fully understand. Every person who had posed for a photograph had made choices about what to reveal and what to conceal, about how to present themselves to the camera and to future viewers, and those choices reflected the tensions and negotiations that were fundamental to human social life in every era. Rachel's work as a conservator had given her the privilege of looking closely at these choices, and sometimes, through the application of advanced technology and careful research, of recovering the stories that people like Elizabeth had tried to preserve even as they hid them from casual view. The legacy of the Elizabeth Holloway Project continued to unfold in unexpected ways, with new discoveries and connections emerging even years after the initial restoration had been completed. A researcher in the Philippines had contacted Rachel after reading about the project, explaining that he had been studying American military records from the early 20th century and had found documentation related to Daniel Patterson's service and death. The researcher had discovered that Daniel had been well regarded by his fellow soldiers and had kept a detailed journal during his time in the Philippines, and that this journal had been preserved in a military archive and was available for examination. Rachel had worked with Jennifer Caldwell to obtain copies of the journal, and they had found that Daniel's final entries, written just days before his death, included passages about his love for Elizabeth and his dreams of returning home to marry her and build a life together in the mountains of North Carolina. These journal entries provided a poignant complement to the letters that Elizabeth had preserved, offering Daniel's perspective on their relationship and confirming the depth and sincerity of the feelings that had motivated Elizabeth to hold his photograph and letter so tightly during that church anniversary celebration in 1904. Rachel often reflected on the remarkable chain of circumstances that had led to the recovery of Elizabeth's story, from the decision of Margaret Holloway to preserve the damaged photograph in a locked box in her attic, to Jennifer Caldwell's choice to seek professional restoration rather than simply discarding the deteriorated image, to Rachel's own careful observation that had detected the unusual positioning of Elizabeth's hands and prompted the investigation that had revealed the concealed objects. At any point in this chain, different decisions could have been made that would have resulted in the permanent loss of this story, and Rachel felt a profound sense of gratitude and responsibility, knowing that she had played a role in ensuring that Elizabeth's love for Daniel and her quiet act of remembrance would not be forgotten. The experience had reinforced Rachel's conviction that every historical photograph deserved careful attention and respect, because even the most ordinary-looking images might contain extraordinary stories that could illuminate aspects of human experience that were often overlooked or undervalued in conventional historical narratives. It was work that required patience, skill, and dedication, but it was also work that connected Rachel to the deepest questions about human experience, about love and loss, memory and forgetting, and the ways that people found to maintain their authentic selves within communities and social systems that often demanded conformity and the suppression of individual feelings and experiences. The photograph of Elizabeth Holloway would always remain one of Rachel's most significant projects, a reminder of why she had chosen this profession and what she hoped to accomplish through her careful and respectful engagement with the fragile documents that preserved the faces and stories of people who had lived in earlier times and whose experiences still had the power to move and inspire those who took the time to look closely and to ask questions about what they were seeing. As she turned her attention to the new photograph waiting on her examination table, Rachel felt the familiar sense of anticipation and possibility, wondering what hidden stories this image might contain and what techniques she might need to employ to reveal them. The work of conservation was never finished, and there were always more photographs waiting to be examined, more stories waiting to be recovered, and more connections waiting to be made between past and present, between the people who had lived in earlier eras and those who sought to understand and honor their experiences in the present day.